Hello, BookTube, and welcome to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club for March. We are reading The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. Great big thing that'll easily double as your March of the Mammoth for the month. That is the third and final volume in her trilogy of novels centering around the character of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's famous, infamous lawyer and leg breaker and fixer and policymaker, who here is an unvarnished hero. In these novels, he is an unvarnished hero. When it comes time for him to do any of the frankly avaricious or brutal things that we know the real Thomas Cromwell did, they are buried in narrative layers. We'll get to that. But for right now, the book opens in May of 1536. And it opens on a very pointed moment. It opens with the death of Anne Boleyn. It opens with her execution. She is beheaded by a French swordsman who was shipped in at expense to make sure that it was clean and neat. Her head comes off in one easy blow. As the narrative tells us, 7 years for the king to get Anne, 3 years to reign, 3 weeks to bring her to trial, and 3 heartbeats to finish it all. Cromwell is in the audience for that execution, as are all of the young men that are in his orbit. His son, his nephew, their friends. And a whole bunch of other people as well, including a couple of people that will play major roles in the chapters that we're reading today. We're reading part 1 of this book today. It's neatly set up into parts. We'll read part 2 and part 3 next time, but part 1 is a little longer. So we're reading part 1 today, and one of the characters who's there in the audience is the Duke of Richmond, young Fitzroy, who is Henry VIII's bastard on the sister of Anne Boleyn, and Bessie Blount. Bessie Blount gave birth to this boy that Henry didn't acknowledge him, never put him in the normal line of succession, but by this point he is a young man, and he is there in the audience watching when Anne's head is taken off her shoulders. So we have a very discreet start here, and young Fitzroy is going to play a part in these chapters because Anne is dead. She gave Henry a daughter, but no sons. Henry is now wed to Jane Seymour. She is from fertile stock, but she has so far given him nothing. So all eyes are turning to Richmond. It's looking a lot like Henry might have to put an instrument through Parliament legitimizing him. Doesn't really want to do that, but it looks like that might be true. So we recur to Richmond quite often in these chapters. And again, I want to point out here that the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club is not particularly involved with spoilers. I'm not particularly concerned with them. So if you want a book club, especially historical fiction where the details are known, you just have to look up the dates to know them. I'm not going to tiptoe too much around spoilers in the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. I'll be more careful about it in other videos, but not in these. So if you're worried about that, definitely don't, if you haven't read this, definitely don't watch these videos. Because in these chapters, Richmond dies. Of course, one of the tragedies of young Fitzroy is that he dies. So even a bastard son, Henry can't manage to keep alive. Another death that happens in these chapters is Erasmus. Never comes on stage in the Cromwell books. His friend Thomas More, of course, is very much on stage in Wolf Hall, but Erasmus never comes on stage. He is just talked about. There's a wonderful exchange here where when the word is finally confirmed, rumor has been spreading, but the word is finally confirmed that Erasmus is dead. And Cromwell says to Henry, when they're talking, Cromwell says he civilized us, and Henry says, well, he died with work to do then, because we're not quite civilized. Those are elements here. There are other elements here. For instance, Mary, Henry's oldest living child. It's unthinkable that a woman would rule, and so no one is thinking that way. But nevertheless, it's not a question of succession. It's a question of whether or not she is bowing to Henry's will, bowing to the supremacy of his current queen by saying that her mother was never queen. That Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Mary's mother, was never actually his wife at all, and that she is not legitimately a princess of the realm. She is being mulish, and also, just to add more to Henry's family woes, his niece, Meg Douglas, embarks, in the chapters that we're reading today, embarks on an affair. Actually tells Cromwell that she is physically plighted in marriage to one of the Norfolk people, to the Norfolk faction, who were, keep in mind, Anne Boleyn was part of the Norfolk faction, so it's the last thing that she should ever have done. It was extremely unwise, and these become troubles that Cromwell has to deal with. Cromwell and his men, Sir Richard Rich, Call Me Riesly, all the men that he has in his orbit, all the men that are his fellow fixers for Henry VIII, have to come to terms with all of this. They have to deal with these little troubles, so many of which are governed by vows and invisible skeins of loyalty all throughout. For instance, Cromwell was aided in the downfall of Anne Boleyn by some of the oldest families in England who don't like Cromwell. He's jumped up nobody. As he puts it, he doesn't have a history. He just has a past. He's from nobody. He's from Putney. They don't like him, but they made an invisible, a silent alliance with him to bring down the Boleyns. That also is there as well, and we get lots of quotes along those lines. We're told, when the dying ask for you, you must appear in person. That comes up over and over again, especially in relationship with some previously unknown visits that Cromwell has made to the old dying queen. But also we're told vows to the living may be set aside if they give you permission, but that the dead do not negotiate. And at one point, Cromwell points out something that the real Cromwell would never have thought about, and certainly would never, he was not eloquent, he would never put it this way. But he mentions as a quote that I want to give, that's the point of a promise. It wouldn't have any value if you could see what it would cost you when you made it. This is important because the Cromwell that we get here is very much a being of keeping his word. He's very much a being of vowing to help people. He vows to Thomas Wyatt's father that I will take care of your boy. He makes vows about Princess Mary and whatnot that we learn about in these pages. I want to stress again that the real Cromwell was not like that, but we're dealing with a fictional creation here. Although the real Cromwell does pop up now and again. For instance, at one point he's having a tense interview with the Earl of Surrey, and Surrey looks up at him in a miserable face and says, I wish I were dead. And then he corrects himself and said, no, I take it back. I wish you were dead. That is absolutely true. That would absolutely be the case. We get Mary's willful stubbornness in this chapter. We get Meg Douglas's willful stubbornness in this chapter. Off camera, we never get the actual appearance, but Reginald Pole, a scion of one of those old families, people who have Plantagenet blood and fully believe they should rule the kingdom, not a Tudor. Reginald Pole never shows up either. He is off stage in Europe, but he is making a lot of trouble for Henry. Writes a horrible, scandalous letter that naturally finds its way to Cromwell's people and then to Henry and outrages him. We also get a great disquisition. Cromwell remembers something that he says to the emperor's ambassador about the nature of kings and their dreams, because there's a wonderful scene in these chapters where Cromwell is woken out of bed for an emergency. He thinks the worst. He thinks that he might be walking to his own execution. He has no idea. When you're at court at the favor of a prince, any day could be your last, as we're going to see at the end of this book. But no, it's that the king had a bad dream. And Cromwell has to figure out what that means. And we get a passage. I copied it down because I want to read it. It's wonderful. It's one of the indulgences, the kind of indulgence that makes this book so long, is that Mantell in this volume never denies herself any of these rhetorical indulgences. The quote is, he had once said to Cranmer, the dreams of kings are not the dreams of other men. They are susceptible to visions in which the figures of their ancestors come to speak to them of war, vengeance, law, and power. Dead kings visit them. They say, do you know us, Henry? We know you. There are places in the realm where battles have been fought, places where the wind in certain direction, moon waning, the night obscure, you can hear the thunder of hooves and the creak of harness, the screams of the slain. And if you creep close, if you were the thin air, suppose you were the spirit who could slide between the blades of grass, then you would hear the aspirations of the souls of England. Cry to me, the king tells him. To me, every king. Each king carries the crimes of other kings, and the need for restitution rolls down the years. Henry often thinks these kinds of things to Thomas Cromwell, and Cromwell remembers them all. He's keeping a book of his own called the Book of Henry. I read that quote again for this read-along and remembered the old black and white movie, The Prince and the Pauper, the adaptation of the Mark Twain novel, The Prince and the Pauper, in which the old king, who is King Henry VIII, is on his deathbed. And he's a vengeful, dark, violent guy. He's not really attractive character at all. But when he reaches his end, he sort of slumps a little and says to nobody in particular, "Now to face them all." It's the same thing, that this celestial company of kings. It's wonderful stuff. I'm hoping that those of you who are trying this out are enjoying it. I've been hearing from a lot of you that a lot of you this will be a reread. There's only one thing that I want to make, one overarching point that I want to make about these opening chapters. We'll read part 2 and part 3 for next weekend. There's only one overarching thing that I want to point out about this, that some of you may be noticing, especially if you are taking a chance and reading it for the first time without having read the other 2 books, which is a kind of unfocused feel. It's wonderful that you don't get prose like this maybe twice in a decade. So it's wonderful to read, but it is a little bit unfocused, and there's a reason for that. There's a very strong focus in Wolf Hall. You may not notice it the first time you read the book, but it is organizing the book. It is keeping the book under strict control. And that focus is downfalls. The downfall of Thomas Wolsey and the downfall of Thomas More. And in Bring Up the Bodies, the second book, there is also an organizing principle. And it's the downfall. It's the downfall of Anne Boleyn and her brother and a whole bunch of other people, a whole bunch of other guys. Anne Boleyn, because she did not serve the king, in his view. All the other guys, all the hangers-on, because Cromwell is working vengeance against them for how unfeeling they were about the downfall of the cardinal. So Bring Up the Bodies is a revenge plot that comes out in great detail. And in both those cases, Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, the downfall of Cardinal Wolsey, of course, we're told that Cromwell had no part in that, and he very much had a part in the downfall of Thomas More. And then in Bring Up the Bodies, where he fences verbally with Anne Boleyn quite a bit, but he is bringing her down. He is set about her downfall. Once he knows that's what the king wants, he sets about her downfall. In both those books, not only is there an overarching impetus to the narrative, but Cromwell is aware of it. He's aware of the overarching narrative because he's a part of it. He's making it happen. And the reason why The Mirror and the Light might feel a little bit wandery is because it too has an overarching plot, but Cromwell is not aware of it because it's his own downfall. He's not working for his own downfall, obviously. So when we hear him say things like, you go into a room, you hear a door bang, you feel someone has run from your approach, but at the same time you feel that someone is watching you, well, he's used to the ins and outs of court, but that is a case being built against him. And that's why this might feel a little less focused, because Cromwell was providing the focus in the first 2 books, and he can't in this one. Instead, we have to bring the focus to this because we know that the organizing focus of this book is his own downfall. But we have a long way to go before we get there. There'll be little pitter-patter feats of it coming at every step of the way. We just have to watch for them, that's all. But I'm losing the light, so I'm going to wrap this up. That is our first installment of The Mirror and the Light. Let me know what you're making of it, especially sound off if you've been brave enough to jump into this without having read the first 2 books. And, of course, any questions that you might have. But we'll be back next weekend. Not sure how logistically that will work, but I will make it work. We'll be back next weekend with the next 2 parts to the book. So we're in the summer of 1536 right now. That is all that we're reading. This is a slower paced novel. We are reading part 1, which is from the beginning of the book to page 167 in my Indian subcontinent volume here. Part 2 and part 3. Part 2 starts in the autumn of 1536, and we go all the way to the autumn of 1537, so a whole year, and that goes from page 255 to page 507. Reads like butter, so you're not going to mind reading all that much. So that's what we're doing next time. That's what we'll be talking about next weekend. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.